Hello dolls and welcome back to another video. I am still a little sick. I talked about this in last week's video. I came down with a heavy cold and I feel like you can definitely still hear it, but that also meant that I had a little more time on my hands last week as I was just trying to get better. And I have been wanting to make this video for a while now and I had it scheduled for this week. And I loved researching for it because I fell into this wonderful world, into this tunnel of dreams, and it was just so absolutely incredible. I really enjoyed learning about this place and time, and it's something that I knew a lot about, but not as much as I know now, and I'm very grateful that I had the time to research all of this because it was so truly incredible. But yeah, I feel like I usually talk where I'm a little more outspoken about my love for the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, 1960s British music. But I do have another big passion when it comes to 1960s music, and that is that very sweet little crossover of 1960s music that came from Laurel Canyon. It was everything from folk to psychedelic rock to more rock-heavy songs, and it's just this very special place and time that I really wanted to make a video about. So get yourself a tea, get comfortable, and join me on a little trip to Laurel Canyon in the 1960s. Just one more thing before we get into the video. I found a documentary that is titled Laurel Canyon, A Place and Time by Alison Elwood. It's a 2-part documentary television series. I was able to watch it through Arte, which is this channel on TV, and they're also online, where they are very focused on art and history. But I think it is also on Amazon Prime, and I cannot recommend you to watch it enough. It is absolutely incredible. A lot of the stories that I'm telling you today come from that documentary. Of course, I did more research. As always, all of my sources are linked either in the description box or in a comment if it's too much. But yeah, now without any more talking, welcome to Laurel Canyon. There was a time when music came drifting down from the hills above Los Angeles. Not just from the radios, but from the houses themselves. Through the open windows and half-finished cabins and vine-covered shacks came the sound of a generation trying to find itself. Bright acoustic chords, layered harmonies, the rustle of notebooks, and the rhythm of something freer than what the city below could offer. Laurel Canyon, in those years, wasn't simply a neighborhood. It was a world within a world, a bohemian outpost perched high above the glittering sprawl where artists came not just to perform, but to live together, sing together, fall in and out of love, and make sense of the times. Its history didn't begin with the music, of course. There had been actors, beatniks, and witches and outlaws hiding away up there for decades. But something shifted in the late 1960s. The folk scene from the East Coast had begun migrating west, drawn by California's light and promise. Rock and roll was beginning to flower into something more poetic, more introspective, and the canyon's peculiar mix of isolation and community offered just the right soil. Joni Mitchell wrote Ladies of the Canyon in a sun-drenched home on Lookout Mountain, while Crosby, Stills and Nash crafted the warm harmonies of Our House in the comfort of shared domestic bliss. The Mamas and the Papas sang Monday, Monday just down the bend, and Jim Morrison paced barefoot through the twilight with lyrics in his head. It was a very small world, Jackson Browne later recalled. We could walk to each other's houses. For a moment, it felt like utopia, a place where the boundaries between life and art, between the personal and the political, dissolved under the California sun. And yet, for all its golden light and harmony, Laurel Canyon held shadows too. And what unfolded there would shape not only the sound of a generation, but the myths, mysteries, and heartbreaks woven into its legacy. Chapter 1, Before the Music, Silence and Wilderness. Long before the 12-string guitars rang through the trees or barefoot poets wandered the winding hills, Laurel Canyon was a place of silence and wilderness. Tucked away into the Hollywood Hills, just minutes from Sunset Boulevard, this steep and curving ravine has always existed on the edge of two worlds, civilization and dream. Laurel Canyon is a wooded, mountainous neighborhood in the Santa Monica Mountains of Los Angeles. It was originally inhabited by the Tongva or Gabrielino people. I quickly want to interrupt here and just say I found different sources referring to the group by different names, and I also tried to research whether it is okay to say both of these terms, and what I found it is. But if it is not, please let me know. I don't want to harm anyone. This is just from the research that I did and everything that I could find out. But groups of the Tongva and Gabrielino people had lived there for thousands of years. Under Spanish and Mexican rule, the hills were used for sheep grazing. On September 9th of 1850, California became the 31st state of the US, and soon Anglo-American settlers arrived, drawn by water rights. In the early 1900s, the canyon was a wild stretch of land, known for its steep cliff, dense chaparral, and a single dusty road carved along the old bed of the creek. It was rustic, even dangerous, with landslides and isolation cutting it off from the rest of Los Angeles. But for some, that very isolation was the draw. The canyon was remote until a dirt road, which later turned into the Laurel Canyon Boulevard, was built in 1907. In 1908, developers formed the Lookout Mountain Park and Water Company. They purchased 280 acres of land on Lookout Mountain, just west of Laurel Canyon. The plot was subdivided and marketed as mountain vacation properties. On August 14th of 1908, the Los Angeles Times announced that the company would build the Lookout Mountain Inn at the summit of Lookout Mountain. They were also planning on building Sunset Plaza Roads and Lookout Mountain Park, a bungalow land at Laurel Canyon Boulevard, and the Lookout Mountain Avenue, as well as Wonderland Park. In 1910, Charles Mann, a real estate developer, and Richard Shoemaker, an electrical engineer, built a so-called trackless trolley, a trolley bus line, starting passenger service on September 11th as the first commercial trolley bus operations in the United States. It ran up Laurel Canyon Road from the Pacific Electric Laurel Canyon shuttle stop at Sunset Boulevard to the tavern at the top of Lookout Mountain Road, a roadhouse serving visitors. Until 1819, the shuttle service traveled up and down Laurel Canyon to meet the half-hour schedule to Los Angeles. It was insufficiently patronized and discontinued when demand failed to support it in 1924. I was interested in why that happened, and from what I read, I think it was largely because by 1924, the roads were a lot better and more people started to own their own cars. So that's why they kind of made that shift. On October 26, 1918, a fire fanned by strong Santa Ana winds burned about 200 acres and totally destroyed the Lookout Mountain Inn. By the 1910s and 1920s, Laurel Canyon began attracting eccentric settlers and early Hollywood stars who were enchanted by its untamed beauty. The Canyon Country Store, which is still open today, opened its doors in 1913 and quickly became a neighborhood anchor. It was later immortalized by Jim Morrison in the Doors' Love Street, which describes the Canyon Country Store as, quote, the store where the creatures meet, as the store became a place for impromptu jam sessions with the various artists who'd soon populate the mountain. But years before the 1960s music crowd populated the canyon, silent film stars like Clara Bow, Tom Mix, and even early cowboy actors built rustic cabins tucked away from the public eye at Laurel Canyon. A Los Angeles article from 1919 described Laurel Canyon as, quote, a sun-dappled Eden for those who seek the charm of nature without leaving the city. Laurel Canyon runs between West Hollywood and the San Fernando Valley, forming a natural corridor of escape. It was this paradox, accessible yet secluded, that would define its allures for decades to come. In the 1920s, the famous Lookout Mountain Inn stood at the canyon's high point, offering panoramic views of LA. But as said, it burned down in 1929. And while people are pretty sure that it was because of the strong Santa Ana winds, there's still a little bit of mystique around the actual circumstances, because The US government ended up buying the land and they built a secretive Air Force film studio called the Lookout Mountain Air Force Station, which operated quietly from the 1940s all the way to the 1960s. And there are many conspiracy theories about this, but more on that later. Here, military propaganda and atomic bomb tests were quietly documented, just minutes away from where Joni Mitchell would one day sing about stardust and morning coffee. You can feel the ghosts of the past in Laurel Canyon, some of them glamorous, some of them strange, wrote Michael Walker, the author of Laurel Canyon, the inside story of rock and roll's legendary neighborhood, in his book. By the 1950s, bohemians began moving in, painters, writers, outcasts. These hills became the fertile ground for people with little interest in conformity or the American dream. You could live cheaply, live weirdly, and most importantly, live artistically. There's a story, half truth, half legend, that a young Jim Morrison once wandered up Lookout Mountain and decided right then that he'd never leave LA. And while Jim wouldn't move to the canyon until the mid to late 1960s, the idea holds weight. Laurel Canyon didn't just house artists, it enchanted them. Chapter 2. First Arrivals and Folk Rock Sparks, Pioneers on Lookout Mountain. In the mid-1960s, the quiet canyon high above Hollywood took on an almost mythical quality, a bohemian refuge where music and life intertwined. Nestled in eucalyptus groves and hillside bungalows, Laurel Canyon was, quote, serene, like living in the country, but you were in the big city, as Byrds guitarist Roger McGuinn later recalled. Its winding dirt roads and pine-scented air felt utterly removed, yet a short drive led down to Sunset Strip's neon bustle. Joni Mitchell captured the canyon's reputation in her wry way. Ask anyone in Hollywood where the craziest people live, and they'll say Laurel Canyon. Ask anyone in Laurel Canyon where the craziest people live, and they'll say Lookout Mountain. So I bought a house on Lookout Mountain, she laughed. In spring, the hills did burst with wildflowers, and at night the only sounds were cats, owls, and mockingbirds in the darkness. The place exuded creative freedom, perfumed with eucalyptus and humming with creative energy, as one writer later put it. The perfect antidote to the regimented studio grind. The music scene didn't spring up here because of marketing, it grew organically. Its roots lie within a few early arrivals. Frank Zappa is often cited as a pioneer. He'd moved to the corner of Lookout Mountain and Laurel Canyon Boulevard by the late 1960s. But the real spark was the Byrds' success. After their electrified folk rock hit, Mr. Tambourine Man, hit in 1965, quote, everybody moved to Laurel Canyon. It was the spot, as Richie Foray of Buffalo Springfield recalled. Indeed, when Buffalo Springfield opened at the Whiskey A Go-Go on Sunset, fans and fellow musicians alike began drifting up the hill to live and write songs. Soon the canyon was a mix of exiles and dreamers. Joni Mitchell and Neil Young came from Canada, Stephen Stills and J.D. Southern from Texas, Glenn Frey from Detroit and Linda Ronstadt from Tucson. As manager Elliot Roberts put it, Laurel Canyon truly was, quote, a melting pot of talent. And even established pop stars found their way there. By 1965, John and Michelle Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas were already living on Lookout Mountain, and by 1968, The Doors' Jim Morrison was spending time at a cabin by the Canyon Country Store. The Monkees' Mickey Dolenz and Peter Tork, two quite unexpected figures in this folk rock orbit, turned up in the hills too, partying with David Crosby, Cass Elliot, and the rest. Everyone was bound by geography and the incredibly affordable rents. Houses in the canyon were remarkably cheap. Joni Mitchell bought her house for just $36,000, a fraction of city prices. As one observer noticed, Artists didn't move there for fame. They moved there because it was a cheap place to live, with easy access to LA and clubs like the Troubadour and the Whiskey A Go-Go. In fact, Sunset Boulevard was only a 5-minute drive away. By day, the canyon was alive with music. Buffalo Springfield all loved rehearsing in one house, the Doors cranking through new songs in another. In the evening, the urban din fell away. In the cool mountain air, one heard nothing but strummed guitars and coyotes howling. As David Crosby remembered, it was a place where talent could come off the road and breathe. Quote, "It was like living in the country," he said, "but you were still in Los Angeles." The houses, often simple clapboard bungalows with redwood trim, were still very affordable, which meant young musicians could take off a year of touring to write an album and still make rent. To be honest, many even lived here before they were touring or even under contract at all. Many of the bands playing at the Troubadour or Whiskey every night rented houses together or slept on someone else's couch in the canyon. Chapter 3: The Mad Scientist and the Dreamers. Zappa's Laboratory. During the 50s and early 60s, mostly beatniks and classic film stars were using Laurel Canyon as a hideaway. Most of the houses there were merely huts built from wood, and while the cabins were beautiful, a lot of the cabins on Laurel Canyon were lacking the amenities of the city houses, but they were also really cheap. That was kind of the allure of it. However, up until the mid-1960s, it wasn't really a place for people to live full-time. And then came Frank Zappa, Laurel Canyon resident and mad scientist magician. Moving into a log cabin on the corner of Laurel Canyon Boulevard and Lookout Mountain in 1968, Zappa turned the decaying former home of cowboy star Tom Mix into a countercultural nerve center, completed with peepholes in the walls, mattresses on the floor, and a rotating cast of misfits, musicians, and surrealists. It was like Fellini's Satyricon met the Marx Brothers, Alice Cooper recalled, wide-eyed of visiting Frank Zappa's house. Zappa had signed the fledgling Alice Cooper to his record label after watching the band clear out a room in 10 minutes. They basically just made these horrible noises, and Alice Cooper recalled how within 10 minutes everyone had left, but there was one man still there, and that was Frank Zappa. He loved that we repelled people, Alice Cooper said. He told us, don't change a thing. Frank Zappa championed the bizarre and the avant-garde, delighting in any that defined the peace and love platitudes of the day. But he was more than a provocateur. He was a highly disciplined composer who insisted on rehearsal, order, and artistic rigor. The canyon, in turn, absorbed his spirit of unfiltered creativity. His cabin became a mythic place, an anarchic incubator that helped stretch the scene's boundaries beyond folk and acid rock. He lived with his wife, children, and nannies, and eventually a group of girls calling themselves the GTOs. If you've been on my channel for a little longer, you know that I absolutely adore them. I'm not gonna go into every detail of who they were in every single video. But if you want to know more about this time and the Zappa house, I highly recommend you to read Miss P's biography. He ended up signing the GTOs, even though none of them knew how to play an instrument or had ever written a song before. Frank really wasn't looking for potentially commercially successful bands. He was looking for weird, wild, and wonderful. In the words of Miss Pamela, a member of the GTOs, and of course the legendary groupie, Frank didn't party, he watched the party. He was always collecting characters. Chapter 4: Love, Doors, and the Label Game, Contracts, Idol Worship, and Billboard Dreams. Musically, Laurel Canyon hosted a transition. The early wave was folk rock and psychedelia. The Byrds electrified Bob Dylan songs, and bands like The Doors and Love blasted through rock experiments. Interestingly, these two bands are connected in a really special way. In the mid-1960s, Love, led by Arthur Lee, was the first rock band to sign with Elektra. They had a couple of offers from music studios, but were keen on keeping the rights to their songs after being told by Little Richard that that is where the money is. So when Elektra signed them, they were ecstatic. However, it soon turned out that they really weren't too satisfied with Elektra. They felt like the label wasn't putting enough effort into marketing them. Arthur Lee noted that the Loving Spoonful were their big idols, and they wanted to be just as successful. Back then, the band often hung out at the Whiskey, and so soon they heard the Doors play. Of course, they were simply phenomenal, but because Jim was often drunk, they hadn't been signed yet. During the same time, more and more labels showed interest in Love, but Arthur knew he needed to bring Elektra, another rock band, to let them off the hook. Basically, he figured that another major record label, maybe one that specified a little more in rock music, would help them reach their full potential, because Elektra had only signed one rock band at the time, it was Love, and they knew that if they wanted to leave, they needed to bring them someone else. So one night, he invited their manager out to the Whiskey A Go-Go. He had told them that the Doors were the next big thing, but Jim was so drunk that night that he was barely standing up on stage. Their manager really wasn't impressed at all, and so for a while it seemed like the plan didn't really work. However, Arthur wasn't one to give up. He begged his manager to come back another night, and that's when it happened. Arthur recalled how Jim was in one of the best shapes of his life. The girls loved him, and the performance was simply spectacular. They were signed on the spot that very night. However, Arthur's plan didn't work. Elektra didn't let them go, and on top of that, they were now putting all their efforts into the Doors. All the resources and PR Love had ever wished for were all of a sudden at the Doors' feet. When their first album was released, Elektra rented out a huge billboard, something that had never been done before for a band and an album release. And so Love, even though they're one of my all-time favorite bands, never got to reach their full potential. Or I don't even want to say potential, but they never got to the place where they could have reached the kind of stardom that the Doors reached. They really never got the career they dreamed of, but without them, the Doors wouldn't have either. This anecdote highlights the interconnectedness of the Laurel Canyon music scene, where artists often supported each other's careers, even when outcomes didn't align with their intentions. I found it incredibly interesting to hear Arthur talk in the documentary, and it really touched me because he was speaking with so much love about the Doors. And yes, there was some sadness to it because he really feels like he missed out on a career because he introduced the Doors to Elektra. But then on the other hand, he's also happy for them, which I think is such a wonderful thing. And it is so emblematic for the Laurel Canyon scene, where everyone seemed to support each other. Love's career never reached the heights they had dreamed of, but they're one of my all-time favorites. So I would love to share the story behind their masterpiece, Forever Changes, from 1967. This whole album was recorded in just 8 days at the RCA studios. They tracked the album live with only minor overdubs, an almost claustrophobic creative spirit that truly mirrored the Laurel Canyon intensity. Bassist Johnny Eccles later recalled how the band would bolt from rehearsals up in the hills to lay down takes in Hollywood, then race home before dawn to sleep on a friend's couch. The result? A psychedelic folk rock record that wasn't a hit at the time, but since has been hailed as one of the era's greatest albums. Quote, "We wanted to capture the raw magic of our rehearsals," Eccles said. No Pro Tools, no safety net, just the canyon swinging in our speakers. Chapter 5, Harvest of Harmony, From Folk Roots to Canyon Ballads. But by the late 1960s, a more introspective singer-songwriter ethos began to dominate. Many of the Canyon's veterans had folk roots, and that influence never fully left. Younger newcomers like Jackson Browne, James Taylor, and Graham Nash were drawn by the lure of acoustic guitars and sunlit jam sessions. One veteran joked that artists in the hills wanted to emulate the cheerful energy of East Coast bands. Quote, "We wanted to be the new Lovin' Spoonful with everything written for us and just presented on a silver platter. Good time guys from the West Coast." one musician reminiscent. It's easy to see why the Laurel Canyon community admired John Sebastian's laid-back pop-folk approach. His band's hits floated on AM radio just as the canyon residents floated in its still pools. Chapter 6. Our House in Harmony. Kitchen Table Constellations. The collaborative spirit was palpable. Musicians wandered freely between houses, and the late-night sessions were truly legendary. In one iconic moment, David Crosby recalled bringing an unknown beautiful blonde singer, then living on Lookout Mountain, to a party Cass Elliot threw for the visiting Eric Clapton. In the middle of a barbecue, she sat in the grass and started singing and playing the guitar. She wasn't impressed by all the famous musicians around her. Cass Elliot, Eric Clapton, whose first time in America this was, and who really wasn't known there yet. Mickey Dolenz and Peter Tork all sat and listened. By the end of the night, Eric was mesmerized by the beautiful Joni Mitchell and her unique fingerstyle guitar playing. There are many pictures of this evening and all the other gatherings at Laurel Canyon. Photographer Henry Diltz immortalized the scene in dreamy pictures that now tell the stories of the long-lost Laurel Canyon crowd. Over wine or joint smoke, friends would share unfinished songs and teach each other new chords. As many of the people living on Laurel Canyon recalled, they would play songs for one another with acoustic guitars in all-night jam sessions in each other's houses. Indeed, one of the sweetest fruits of this era was Crosby, Stills, and Nash's song Our House, celebrating just such communal living, written about Joni Mitchell's Laurel Canyon home, where for those three, everything had started. But more on that later. Strolling through the canyon back then felt like visiting your hippie cousins. At any pool party or kitchen table, you might witness the next Crosby, Stills, and Nash huddle, or hear David Crosby dub the young Jackson Browne, quote, the new wave of canyon music, as Browne softly sang Song for Adam by a fireplace. If Henry Diltz captured the canyon's warmth, Nurid Wild captured its heart. Nurid really impressed me in the documentary. I adore her story, and so I really wanted to tell it because I feel like when we speak about the Laurel Canyon crowd, we often speak about the very popular musicians that lived there. But the truth is there were more people living there that were just as equally important for the canyon and the spirit. Born in Israel and raised on sharp edges and bold contrasts, Nurid arrived in Los Angeles as a photographer with a rock and roll eye and magnetic presence. Quote, I wasn't there to document, she later said. I was there because I belonged. Her work, candid, shadowy, intimate, cut through the haze of the canyon's golden hour glow, revealing its sensual, chaotic underbelly. She photographed the Monkees, Buffalo Springfield, and the early stirrings of what would become the Eagles. And more than once, she turned her lens toward lovers. Nurid had a brief affair with Michael Nesmith of the Monkees, and later gave birth to his child. But her work transcended the usual muse narrative. In an era when women were often subjects, Nurid claimed authorship. Her photos, many shot in Laurel Canyon living rooms and tangled backyards, weren't just portraits. They were scenes from a dream, in which everyone was both posing and performing. Life in Laurel Canyon was vivid and often surreal. For every songwriting session, there were unforgettable anecdotes. Joni Mitchell herself loved to tell this one. One spring afternoon, her mother was visiting, and Joni had just bought a new vase. When Joni stepped out to pick some wildflowers, she came home to find, quote, 3 naked girls floating around on a raft in Frank Zappa's koi pond next door, and her horrified mother gazing at the scene. It was a perfect snapshot of the free-spirited, roll-your-own existence. Nothing was off limits in this rural hideaway. Drugs were everywhere. Some people even said that God's herb was practically the canyon's air refresher, and everyone participated. As David Geffen, Joni's manager, dryly remembered, Laurel Canyon was, quote, a scene with talent, attractive people, and many of them had sex with one another. Lovers swapped partners like they swapped guitar licks, and a broken romance often meant a new song or even a new band. For instance, Graham Nash's breakup with his Hollies bandmates and subsequent romance with Joni Mitchell, whom he'd met years prior in Ottawa, led to the very formation of Crosby, Stills and Nash in Cass Elliott's living room. Before they even sat down at Cass Elliott's kitchen table, they changed the sound of American music. David Crosby, Stephen Stills, and Graham Nash were each already scarred and seasoned by the wreckage of their previous bands. David Crosby had been kicked out of the Byrds in 1967. He was clashing creatively with Roger McGuinn, pushing the band towards longer, more experimental compositions and political themes they weren't ready for. Crosby was also growing harder to work with, opinionated, unpredictable, and prone to monologues during live sets, including a now infamous rant at the Monterey Pop Festival. In truth, David Crosby's vision had outgrown the Byrds, and Laurel Canyon, where he lived in a wooden house high in the hills, gave him the freedom to explore something new. Stephen Stills, meanwhile, had watched Buffalo Springfield fall apart in 1968. That group, which also included Neil Young and Richie Foray, had burned brightly, but briefly, torn apart by internal friction, drug issues, and Neil Young's infamous unreliability. Neil would vanish without notice before big shows, only to reappear just as suddenly. Still, the band had birthed classic hits like For What It's Worth, and Stephen had been the engine behind much of that. Graham Nash, the British import from the Hollies, had grown tired of formula. The Hollies had been chart toppers in the UK, clean harmonies, catchy pop, but Nash was aching for something deeper. When he tried to introduce Joni Mitchell's Both Sides Now to the band, they shot it down. That moment, he would say, marked the beginning of the end. Quote, "They just didn't get it," he recalled. But Joni got it, and it was at her house, her little home in Laurel Canyon, where everything came together. As said, Joni and Graham had already crossed paths in Ottawa years earlier, but Laurel Canyon brought them together again. Their romance was fast and consuming. They were living together by the time Crosby and Stills showed up at Joni's house in 1968. And that's where the real magic happened. According to Stephen Stills, Cass Elliot had been scheming. "Get your guitars and come to Cass's house," she told him. She sensed something was in the air, and she was right. At her place, warm, welcoming, the unofficial salon of the Laurel Canyon scene, Stephen Stills and Graham Nash met again, with David Crosby already there waiting for them. They picked up guitars, they sang, and when their voices locked into harmony for the first time, they all felt it. Graham Nash would later say, "We sang You Don't Have to Cry, and when we hit that harmony, we all looked at each other. We knew it was special. That was the sound." Three voices, Crosby's California cool, Stills' Southern grit, and Nash's Northern English lilt, melting together in effortless three-part harmonies. Their accents, their roots, somehow complementing each other. It was as though they'd been meant to find each other all along, and Laurel Canyon was just the place it was supposed to happen. After recording their self-titled debut album, they drove around LA with Henry Diltz looking for a place to shoot the cover. They took pictures all over town, but when they came by a small, boarded-up house, they knew it was perfect. Henry recalled, I love this part of the story. Henry recalled how after they were done taking the pictures and he was back home, he realized that they were sitting in the wrong order. The record was titled Crosby, Stills, and Nash, but the cover showed Nash, Stills, and Crosby. So he talked the three into going back to reshoot. However, once they arrived, the house was gone. It had been demolished, just after they took the picture that would end up on the record, sold millions of times. But as brilliant as they were vocally, they were still missing a piece, and that became painfully obvious when they were supposed to go on tour. See, Graham Nash and David Crosby could play rhythm guitar, sure, but they didn't have that cutting, electric edge, the kind that could carry a song into a more psychedelic or harder rocking direction that they needed. And that is when Neil Young came in. Although Stephen Stills was hesitant, memories of Neil Young's erratic Buffalo Springfield days, after all, were still quite fresh. They all knew he could play. and they knew Steven and Neil played together like no one else could. They just couldn't quite recreate that sound without him. According to stories, their manager and label reps were pushing for it too. "You need Neil," they told Steven. "You need someone who can really shred." And so they invited him to join. And now it wasn't just Crosby, Stills, and Nash. It was Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. One of my all-time favorite bands. I listen to Helplessly Hoping and Our House probably 3 times a day. These are generally, to me, some of the most beautiful songs. The harmony and the fact that the harmony isn't perfect. It is this very unique blend of voices and sound that I absolutely adore. I personally am a big fan. I am absolutely heartbroken that David Crosby died, and I will never get the chance to see all of them perform together because, truthfully, they're right up there with the Beatles for me. They're just so good, and their music touches me on such a deep level. Neil Young brought friction, yes, he brought drama, but he also brought brilliance, blistering guitar solos, and that rawness that balanced the honey-smooth harmonies. They didn't always get along, famously so, but when it worked, it really worked. They became one of the defying acts of the Laurel Canyon sound. Their debut at Woodstock in 1969, "scared shitless," as Nash described it, was legendary. But it had all started just 1 year before in a house tucked up in the canyons, over a few glasses of wine and a spontaneous harmony sung in Cass Elliot's kitchen. Chapter 7. Candles, Quartz, and Cass, the heartbeat of Canyon hospitality. Cass Elliot herself was the Canyon's benevolent queen bee. Joni and others often popped over for coffee at Cass's. As one friend says, while producing Joni's first album, quote, "We'd all go to Mama Cass Elliot's house, late into the night. Cass kept the doors open, welcoming any songwriter or actor or roadie who wandered by." The rolling sessions and pool parties at her home became the stuff of legends. Eric Clapton would sit slack-jawed by Joni's guitar. Peter Tork of the Monkees would host a strip of grass at his cabin, and Linda Ronstadt and J.D. Souther would fall in love and later help form the Eagles in Cass's orbit. The atmosphere on the canyon was mesmerizing and one of a kind. It almost seemed like a magical little hideout and a place where great musicians became legends. When I looked into the Laurel Canyon scene a little more, I came to realize how unlikely it was for Mickey Dolenz and Peter Tork to actually live there, because the Monkees were a casted band. They were doing the TV show. They were doing all of that, which was so different from everything else anyone else was doing on the canyon. However, I read one detail about Peter Tork, and I knew that's why he lived there. And that is the fact that, yes, there are fun stories like Mickey Dolenz always carrying his camera, which is great because a lot of the footage that I'm showing you in this was shot by him. But Peter Tork apparently was a nudist. I loved finding that out. I think it's such a fun quirk about him. It does not match. It kind of does, but then it also doesn't the very whitewashed image that he presented in the Monkees, but I love that he was just that kind of guy on the canyon. Overall, there are so many more stories about Laurel Canyon. Of course, there's the whole story about the Mamas and the Papas, and how Michelle and Danny's affair broke the band, but then they were able to continue and then later fell apart. There are so many stories that happened on Laurel Canyon, and I really tried to focus on a couple for this video. But as said, I'm gonna have all the sources, everything down below. Watch the documentary, get into the Laurel Canyon scene. It is such a special scene and time, and it is so close-knit and so concentrated on a couple of years, which is something that just fascinates me so deeply. Chapter 8. Joni's Ladies of the Canyon. Portrait of a Canyon Muse. I spoke about her a couple of times now, but I'm just pretty sure that if Laurel Canyon had a voice, it would be Joni Mitchell's. In 1968, fresh from a dissolving marriage and a series of gigs in Toronto coffee houses, Joni fled to Los Angeles, drawn by the climate, the scene, and the possibility of transformation. She found herself on Lookout Mountain Avenue. In that brief moment of stillness before Blue, she composed a record that captured not only her own evolution, but the entire Laurel Canyon state of mind. she composed Ladies of the Canyon, a record that captured not only her own evolution, but the entire Laurel Canyon state of mind. The canyon leaves don't lie, she sang in Morning Morgantown, evoking a tender landscape populated by flute-playing troubadours and shadowy countercultural mothers. Each track introduced a real woman, Trina, Estrella, and Joni herself, anchoring mythic archetypes in earthy detail. Graham Nash remembered watching her ride Woodstock on a quiet afternoon just before dusk. Quote, "She rode it in an hour. It was staggering." Joni wrote Big Yellow Taxi after driving along Mulholland Drive, down on the canyon's clear-cut slopes and newly paved roads. She later said to Mojo magazine, quote, "I remember thinking, they paved paradise and put up a parking lot." That was Laurel Canyon in miniature. It's a perfect example of how the landscape itself became both muse and lament in her work. And that wasn't a rarity. The canyon seemed to inspire musicians to reach greatness. But even as she immortalized the canyon, Joni was beginning to outgrow it. By 1971, Blue would emerge, raw, restless, and stripped of the communal glow. But if you listen closely to Ladies of the Canyon, you can still hear the echo of golden afternoons, of friends lounging barefoot by the window, voices rising and falling with the wind. Chapter 9, The Fall from the Hills, Demise of Utopia. But like all fairy tales, Laurel Canyon's story couldn't last forever. The early spirit of communal living and shared creativity began to unravel as fame, money, and personal turmoil took their toll. Some, like Joni Mitchell, grew disenchanted with the very openness that had once nourished their work. "I had no defense," she later said of that time. "People were partying in my house all the time." She eventually left the canyon for British Columbia, searching for solitude and the clarity to write Blue. Others followed suit. Jim Morrison decamped to Paris. Graham Nash and David Crosby both moved to the beach. Cass Elliot died in 1974, and with her, the scene lost its heart. But the deeper cracks ran through the culture itself. The Manson murders in 1969 cast a long shadow, especially since the killings happened just down the hill on Cielo Drive, and many of the canyon crew knew someone in that circle. The idealism of the hippie era collided with disillusionment, drug addiction, and the corrosive side of the music business. The rise of harder rock and more commercial sounds in the mid-1970s pushed the intimate, harmony-rich canyon vibe of the margins, and even the geography shifted. By the end of the decade, the industry's center of gravity had moved toward Malibu, Topanga, and beyond. Laurel Canyon didn't just vanish, but its magic dimmed. The dirt roads were paved, the quirky cabins were sold off or rebuilt, the wide open doors that once welcomed wandering musicians began to close. What was once hidden Eden became discovered, packaged and mythologized. As the 1970s wore on, a new generation came seeking echoes of the past, but the old ghosts had already moved on. The songs remained, but the spell had been broken. Chapter 10, Ghosts in the Garden, Shadows and Midnight Conspiracies. For all its flower child glow and dulcimer harmonies, Laurel Canyon had shadows. Long, creeping ones that spilled down its winding roads and settled into the walls of its Spanish bungalows. The same era that gave us sunlit songwriting circles and barefoot afternoons also brought in heavier drugs, frayed friendships, and the slow corrosion of utopian ideals. LSD and pot were creative lubricants at first, used to stretch the limits of the mind. But by the early 70s, heroin and cocaine had crept in like mildew, and with them came burnout. Jim Morrison's descent into madness, Graham Parsons' tragic overdose at just 26. These weren't just personal failures, they were omens. The canyon started out with people passing guitars around, said Pamela DeBar, but it ended with people passing out. The idealism didn't vanish overnight, but it curdled into something stranger, more paranoid, more corporate, more lonely. Barney Hoskins in Hotel California wrote that by the mid-1970s, quote, "The canyon had become a zone of decadence and isolation, of cocaine parties and spiritual malaise. The record labels had caught wind of the canyon's magic and swooped in to bottle it. What had once been about community and experimentation was now choked with agents, deadline, and image management. As one musician recalled, we went from playing on porches to hiding in gated driveways. The music was still beautiful, often heartbreakingly so, but it had a different edge. Everyone was stoned," someone once said of those years, but it was a different kind of stoned. It wasn't peace and love anymore, it was escapism. And then there were the conspiracies, the ones that refused to die, flickering like shadows at the edge of the sunshine dream. In books like Weird Scenes, Inside the Canyon, journalist and former Naval Intelligence officer Dave McGowan suggested that the counterculture wasn't as organic as it seemed, that maybe it had been nudged, curated, even manipulated. Too many of the scene's key players, he argued, had strange ties to the military-industrial complex. Frank Zappa, the king of avant-garde chaos, grew up under the watchful eyes of his father, a chemical warfare specialist at Edgewood Arsenal. Jim Morrison's father was the Navy admiral in charge during the Gulf of Tonkin incident, the very event that escalated the Vietnam War. And Stephen Stills? Rumors swirled that he spent time in Central America with military contractors, though hard proof remains elusive. And then, of course, there was the Lookout Mountain Air Force Station, perched high above the canyon like a sentinel. Officially, it was a Cold War-era film studio for classified government footage, including atomic bomb tests. However, conspiracy theorists claim it was more than that. Some say it was used for psychological operations, MK-Ultra mind control experiments, or even surveillance of the artists below. Why else, they ask, would such a facility exist in a residential neighborhood teeming with revolutionary thinkers? Why did the FBI keep so many tabs on musicians? These questions don't have clean answers, which only fuels the myth. Still, for most, these stories remain the stuff of late-night AM radio and tinfoil dreams. But it's true that the air in Laurel Canyon always felt a little heavy, as if something unseen hung in the eucalyptus branches. And when Charles Manson's followers brutally murdered Sharon Tate and others in 1969, just a few winding roads away, it felt less like a random act of violence, and more like the dark mirror of the peace and love movement turned inside out. The hippie ideal hadn't just withered, it had been defiled. As Vanity Fair later wrote, Laurel Canyon was a crucible for idealism, but also the place where that idealism met its reckoning. Whether the conspiracies were ever real or not, something fractured them. The dream bled out right there on Cielo Drive. Chapter 11: Echoes in the Hills, Legacy and Living Myths. Today, Laurel Canyon is quieter. The guitars are mostly unplugged, the record deals signed elsewhere, but the spirit hasn't fully vanished. It's just settled into the soil. The winding roads still twist through eucalyptus and pine, and the light still slants golden through the trees in the late afternoon, like it did when Joni wrote Ladies of the Canyon. Though the scene itself has since long faded into memory, its mythology is still alive and well. A-listers and creatives still move up the old houses or build sleek, glass-walled homes on the canyon slopes. Drawn by privacy, views, and the whispers of what once was, the Zappa estate is now a historical landmark, restored but still eccentric, a kind of time capsule of West Coast weirdness. As one local noted, Laurel Canyon stands out as one of the most notable celebrity enclaves in Los Angeles. But for all its modern polish, there is something intangible here. A flicker of the old magic in the wind chimes, in the stories left in the beams and floorboards. As Jacob Dylan put it in Echo in the Canyon, it was this world where it felt like anything was possible, and maybe it still is. The music never really left. Those shimmering harmonies, sun-drunk lyrics, and open-tuned guitars still echo through today's folk, indie, and singer-songwriter scenes. Artists still cite Laurel Canyon as a compass point, a symbol of what happens when people live, create, and collide in close quarters. Tribute concerts continue, new documentaries keep pulling at the threads, and fans still make the pilgrimage up Laurel Canyon Boulevard, hoping to glimpse something of the past. You can almost hear the distant refrain of "So You Want to Be a Rock and Roll Star" drifting from an empty bungalow at dawn, or the soft opening chords of Woodstock rising in the pines as if someone just struck the first note. As one writer for Indigo Music put it, though the golden era faded by the late 1970s, its impact remains. The music created during this time continues to inspire new generations. Maybe that's the real legacy, not just the songs or the stars, but the reminder that art can bloom wildly and beautifully in even the strangest of places, carried on a canyon breeze that still knows every lyric. So that is it for my video on Laurel Canyon. That is all I got for today. I really hope you enjoyed it. As said, I have this very special connection to the music that came from these houses, and it is so interesting because it is only such a small amount of music. And yes, there were people stopping by, like for example Eric Clapton noted that his visit at Laurel Canyon very much inspired a lot of the music he ended up making afterwards. But the people who actually lived there, who were the scene, because the scene was more than just the music, it was the people, it was the whole spirit of the time. They really shaped all of that, and it was such a close-knit, small group of people, which is absolutely incredible to think about, if I'm being honest. It's also so interesting because the scene that we now refer to as the Laurel Canyon scene really only existed for maybe 5 years, maybe even less. It was this very brief moment in time where these people lived there and made the music, and everything seemed to fall into place. But I would love to know your thoughts, feelings, and opinions about Laurel Canyon. Which bands are your favorites? Which songs do you enjoy the most? Is there something about the conspiracy theories that you might want to add? I think it is so interesting, like the whole CIA mind control LSD pipeline in the 60s. One day I might make a video about that, but there's just so much there. But I found it really interesting that they conducted all of these tests and footage and whatever they were doing in the middle of this neighborhood. And as said, that is why a lot of people say that maybe the Mountain Inn didn't just burn down on accident, but that they did that so that they would then be able to buy the plot and therefore start building their secret facility. And it is so interesting because it's been 60 years and still to this day, no one really knows what happened inside those walls. But yeah, I really hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, I would love you to give it a thumbs up and maybe even share it with a friend. It supports me, it supports the channel, and it would truly mean the world. My voice is about to die. I'm on my 4th cup of tea while filming this video, and I think it is time for me to just stop talking. But if you enjoyed what you saw, I would love you to subscribe. Come back here next week. I talk about all things 60s and 70s every single week, and I would love to have you around. I hope you have a beautiful day. Go out, enjoy the sunshine, take yourself some time to focus on you and your mental health today, and I will catch you in the next video. Bye, dolls!